Okay, and we are live. So, hello, Doreen. Thank you very much for agreeing to do the podcast with me here today. I'll start by getting you to give a little bit of an introduction about yourself, but I would maybe just say first and foremost, I got to know you and Egil last year, about, I guess, almost half a year ago now. Seems so long ago. The September Icelandic Roots volunteer trip that we did. And so it was wonderful getting to know you in person during that trip. And you had a lot of fantastic stories and interesting things to talk about. So I thought it would be wonderful to get you on a podcast with me here today.
Well, thank you very much. And in my memory on that trip, I was just listening and everybody else was talking. But apparently, I had a few stories to tell. That was such a delightful trip, and it was wonderful to meet you too, Jack. Really, that was an amazing trip because there were I don't know how many of us, 24 or something on the bus, and whatever the number was, and we became family immediately. Partly because we knew we were related at some
Yes, we
level.
were actually family.
Well, most of us were.
Hmm.
Um, my fiance is, by the way, his name is pronounced Eigil, but in Iceland it's Egil. So you got it the
Yeah.
Icelandic way. Yes, that was
Mhm.
interesting. Yes. So we had a wonderful trip together and we didn't get enough time to talk. So we're going to continue that now. Thank you
Yes,
for
yes,
the
no, certainly.
privilege.
Hmm. Okay, so maybe would you like to just then explain your Icelandic roots, your connection, well, maybe to Icelandic Roots as an organization, but then your actual family Icelandic roots, your genealogy connections?
Yes, yes. Well, first I'll say just a couple of sentences maybe about my identity because
Mm.
I've had many lives.
Yes,
So I
sir.
was an opera singer for many years with the Canadian Opera Company and traveled all over the world doing that. Sang on a cruise ship for a whole year with lighter music. And then I went to seminary and became a pastor. And then I went back and got my PhD in biblical studies. And so I'm heavily involved in that right now. And the other thing that I really got me through COVID, although it would have been okay, but was all alone here, was Icelandic Roots. Icelandic Roots, I do not remember how I discovered it, but when I did, I was invited to be a genealogist for an amateur genealogist for the group, and started working on my own family because I have a book of 2 volumes just with my own family going back to 1704, and of course that's just one piece of the family. And so this way we meet, we gather, and online. And so I gained this wonderful number of friends through Icelandic Roots. Now, my Icelandic roots are, like I would say, a good number of us that are involved in this in North America, half. I'm half Icelandic. The other half I believed all my life was Irish, and somehow there was a mistake, and I'm closer to English than Irish. I'm still dealing with
Okay.
that because I liked being half Irish.
The same sort of
Anyway,
fault.
the Icelandic part, our parents and grandparents knew a lot, but they
Mhm.
didn't know as much as we know now from the history that is recorded,
Mhm. Mhm.
because the Icelanders started with their first census in 1703 and include every pauper on the street that didn't even have a home. I just
Uh-huh.
love that. I love being a part of that. So
Mhm.
now I can take my family back, and you can, Jack, and all of
Mhm.
us back
Mhm.
and back and back, and say that. So when I met Eigil, the first thing he said is, "I have a name that perhaps you don't know," and I said, "Oh yes." That was the name of my 25 times great grandfather, Egil
Uh-huh.
Skallagrimsson, the great saga hero.
Yes.
And so that's how our relationship began. Um, that was very interesting to know that.
Mhm.
So my grandparents came to Canada in 1888.
Mhm.
And most of the people that I know on Icelandic roots that are older, that are my age, they it was their great grandparents that came. But
Hmm.
the reason in my case it's the grandparents is that many people in those families had 8 and 10 children, and I'm
mm,
always the last one from the last one. So my grandmothers and grandfathers their ninth child, it was actually their 10th because they had lost one. Their last child um, was my dad. So when I was growing up, all my cousins were 54 and I couldn't play with them. and and so it's just a different, I'm one generation closer, I feel.
mm,
So
mm,
they came, from what I can see, I'm not positive about this. I know for sure they were both on the same ship,
mm,
but I don't know whether they met on that ship or whether they had known each other before,
mm,
because they were from approximately the same area, and they
mm,
were married a year later and settled as homesteaders in around the Winnipeg area in a place that was called Ardal or
mm,
Arborg, and that's where we went. I went as a child to visit my grandparents. My
mhm.
grandparents did not speak a word of English. They meant to learn English, but there was nobody speaking English around the area, so they didn't
Uh-huh.
have that opportunity. So everything I learned from my dad and from Icelandic Roots.
Yes, wonderful. That's a incredible story, and I feel like in some ways I can relate to the like being placed and not always matching up with my cousins in terms of
Right,
being in that same age range.
right. Oh,
Um,
good.
which can happen. But yeah, it's certainly fascinating as you were mentioning just the ability to trace all the way back with the Icelandic genealogy, whereas other sides of the family typically, and you mentioned being 50% Icelandic, and I think that is right. It seems like there is a lot of us with that sort of a ratio.
Hmm.
And then
Hmm.
the other side, where it's maybe a mix of English or Irish or French
Right.
or all these other different Europeans, it's harder to trace those exact things. And even today, with genetic testing and that sort of thing, you can get much better information, but it
Right.
still really isn't the same as having that Icelandic genealogy connection, where you can get that through line traced through, and you can use the Icelandic Roots database and see all these different connections. It's really, really incredible.
And of course, Iceland had a low population for so many
Right.
years. And our leader, Suna Furstenau, she often reminds us when we say, "Oh, I'm the fifth great granddaughter of this person or that one." She says, "We all are."
Yes.
And that's okay, you know.
Uh-huh.
But
Yeah,
it's
some
exciting to
humility.
find those famous people and
Mhm.
powerful people
Mhm.
in
Mhm.
our heritage. It gives us
Well,
strength. I tell my daughter that all the time just to give
mm,
her a feeling of being powerful herself
mhm.
as a woman, especially. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there's a lot that we can get from having these connections. And like you said, it's not just unique to you. We all have this. And even if you're
Yes.
not Icelandic, whatever your genealogy is, if you don't know it even, you can imagine all the different people in history that you are connected to, even if you
That's
think there's
right.
no kings or
Yeah, that's for
queens or anyone
everybody.
interesting. Mhm.
Right. Right.
And then there's other things as well that our genealogy can unlock for us. And I don't know if that exactly connects, but I know you have some sort of a connection to maybe a ghost or some sort of a thing. And I don't know if this was unlocked to you through a genealogy sort of understanding as well, but I just know the story vaguely, and I would like to hear you elaborate on this a little bit more if you could.
Good. Well, you just tell me when to stop.
Okay.
I love this story.
Okay.
I wish I'd kept track of the years. It was maybe 10, 15 years ago.
Hmm.
I got the crazy, unreasonable idea that I
Hmm.
should type in my Icelandic grandmother's name into Google.
Hmm.
Now, come on, she died in 1953.
Hmm.
There would be nothing about her on Google except maybe an obituary. I don't know what I was thinking, but I decided to do it anyway. So I typed in her name, and what popped up was a shock of my life. It was a newspaper article from Victoria, British Columbia, Canada. None of us were from there. What's my grandmother's name doing there?
Hmm.
It turned out that the University of Victoria had a particular series of lectures that took place over a number of years. And on kind of different subjects, I guess, or maybe they were interested in Icelanders. I don't know. But anyway, the lecture was given by a woman named Jónsdóttir, which is the most common name there is, practically, from Iceland. And the topic of the lecture was Icelandic immigrant ghosts.
Huh.
Well, what did that have to do with my grandmother? I was never spoken, no one spoke about a ghost to me in my life. And my father was very close to me, and I'm an only child, and he told me everything. Told me all the secrets of the family, all the things that I probably wasn't supposed to know. And he loved to tell stories like me. So he had never mentioned this. And I figure now the reason is that he was a school teacher and he was kind of fighting, fundamentalism and superstition and nonsense. And he didn't want to have anything to do with it. That's what I think. So, what the lecture said, the woman said in her lecture, was that this ghost had been existing in Iceland since 1703. I don't know if she gave the date, but anyway, this ghost had come over on the ship with an Icelandic family, with my grandmother's parents, and that this ghost had decided to live with my grandmother, and that she lived with my grandmother for many years. I'm
Huh.
reading this in a newspaper article. Newspapers
Uh-huh.
are real. People are real. Ghosts, I don't know. Well, she said that a number of Icelandic ghosts had come over, and so the reason there were not very many existing today was that they were very old and they only last for 4 or 5 generations. Well, mine lasted 8 so far. I don't know where she is now. We
Maybe
had
that's a
plans
record.
for her, but I'll tell you about that later. Um, so, so this is what she said. So my grandmother had this ghost living with her, and that got me started on being interested in the whole situation. And then I discovered, I think that's all I have to say about the newspaper article, just that it got me going. And it's
Yeah.
not on the internet now. I think some things it probably could be found, but I
Mm.
made copies of it, so I've got it. I know that it that lecture happened.
Mhm.
Oh yes, I wanted to say that she mentioned that a number of the ghosts had died, and that the other thing that happened was a lot of them didn't like it in North America and went back. She didn't say whether they went back on the ship or just floated back or what, But
Uh-huh.
so anyway, later when I wrote a book about this, I had her go back for a while and not like it there so much as she thought, and come back to Canada. But that's another story. So then, a number of years later, I was working in China as a biblical scholar at the seminary, and I was there from 2006 to 10. And while I was there, I was looking this up on the internet and finding things, and discovered that there was a book. So then I put the ghost name into the internet, you see. So then it came up that I could not believe this, that in 1860, a German historian had gone to Iceland to study the people of Iceland. And he wrote a book about Iceland. And in his book about Iceland, he said, these people believe in ghosts and little people, hidden people, and all kinds of things.
Mhm.
And he said, and 3 or 4 of them, he gave their names, and he said, they kept mentioning this Leirarskotta, that is the name of my ghost,
Mm.
but they didn't really tell me very much about her, and I was so disappointed. I had to translate the book from German. I had a German colleague who helped me, and
Mm.
it didn't say as much as I would have liked. There were just a couple of things about her
Mm.
in there. But you see, now I have the story from the lecture, which would have been about 2003 or 4, I think, in my
Okay.
memory. I could check it. But anyway, that I have that. And
Mhm.
now I have this history book from 1860 that's in the archives of every major library in the world with her name in it.
Hmm.
So the next story about her, and I'll let you ask me, but this is,
Mm.
I went to Iceland in 2017, with
Mm-hmm.
a woman friend that I've known for years. And we attended the Iceland Writers Retreat, which is a wonderful thing. Everybody who writes needs to go to that at least once. I'd
Mm-hmm.
like to go back, but I haven't found the time.
Mm-hmm.
So at the Iceland Writers Retreat, they took us on a literary tour, and the tour took us to a place called Reykholt, which is very near Borgafjordr, which is Borgfjord, where my people came from. And so a man got up and gave a lecture about the sagas, took us down to the basement of it was in a church, and he took us down to the basement and showed us all the archives and the sagas that had been returned from Denmark and all kinds of wonderful things. And he was a real interesting character. He was the retired pastor of the church. Didn't look any more like a pastor than I do. And I got him in the corner and I thought, get your nerve up, Doreen. Do not be afraid. You're going to ask a retired pastor a question about a ghost. Would you do that in Canada? No, you wouldn't.
Uh-huh.
They would think you were crazy. So I thought, well, there's nobody around. And I said, I'm a pastor too. And he said, that's
Mm-hmm.
nice. And I said, my people come from here. He said, yes, I know. And showed me a gravestone of three greats back grandfathers.
Mm-hmm.
I said, I shouldn't ask you this, but would you tell me something about Leirarskotta? Do you know that name? And he looked at me and he said, of course I do. And that, again, I'm surprised. Every time something to do with her happens, I'm just shocked, really shocked.
Wow.
And he would have been, I don't know, maybe around 70 at the time. He was very lucid and had just given a lecture, and here he is talking about her. Later on, we sent emails to each other, just a couple, and the last one, the one that he sent me, the main one, said to me, he said, and I love this so much, he said, you have a very powerful presence following you around, my lady. He really believes in her, you
Ah,
know,
yeah.
and he now believes that she's with me. I haven't, and my secretary from my last church, she kept saying to me, because she was kind of psychic and I'm not into that at all. And she kept saying, did you talk to her yet? Did you talk to her? I said, oh no, I didn't talk to her. She says, well, ask her to talk to you. And I'm just not ready for anything like that at the moment. But anyway, it's very, very wonderful and exciting. So I wrote a book about her. And the book is because it's 8 generations, I managed to figure out how it worked so that it would come to my grandmother
Hmm.
from 1703. I knew who those people were. And then I
Okay.
worked my way down through their children so that it ended up with my grandmother. I don't know if I got it right, but I think I did.
Mm-hmm. So the
I thought I had
genealogy
it
book.
right. Yeah, I thought I had it right until I went to Iceland with you and the
Mm-hmm.
group. And you remember the bookstores around there? You've been there
Mm-hmm.
before. There was one major bookstore. I think it was Akureyri.
Mm-hmm.
And in that bookstore was a shelf kind of on the side with Icelandic books that had been translated to English.
Mm.
So I picked up a book. I think I had this book before, but didn't. I missed the point. And
Mm-hmm.
this book is called Icelandic Ghost Stories. I'll show it to you here,
Okay. Yep.
Jack.
Mm-hmm.
And 25 Icelandic Ghost Stories by Jon R. Hjalmarsson.
Mm-hmm.
And in this book is about 3 pages about my ghost. And when I read it, I thought he's got it wrong. He's got one person wrong. And then after I got home, I realized that what happened was there were 2 sisters. One was called Kristin, and one was called Hadla Kristin.
Mm-hmm.
And what happened is the story in his book. He says the ghost went to live with Kristin.
Hmm.
Her husband died, and her second husband did not want to have anything to do with ghosts. Her second husband said to the ghost, "Get out and never come back here." And the ghost said to him, and I didn't have any of this in my book. I didn't know this. This is some story everybody else had.
Mm,
The ghost, Leirarskotta, said to him, she says, "Now listen, I've got sore feet and I
mm.
don't have any shoes." See, we don't think of, like, British ghosts don't even have feet, I don't think. They just float around. Icelandic ghosts, Girvaga told me Icelandic ghosts are like us. They have body just like us, you know.
Mm,
Um, anyway, she said, "My feet are sore, and if you give me those brand new boots of yours, I will leave this house forever."
mm,
So, according to the story, according to this story, he gave her his boots. And she went away and was never heard from since. And I thought, oh, yes, she was. Isn't this cool?
uh-huh.
I was quite upset about where did she go, and I discovered, much to my shock, that Hudla Kristen was one of the children, and the next child was Kristen. So there were two Kristens. She went to the other one, and I know that for sure because of the name. Her name changed to Leirarskotta, and Kristen lived at Leira. So that is what I learned, and have to fix up in my book. But it gave it a sense of reality for me. That,
Right.
I mean, how can you make up 8 generations of somebody? Well, maybe you can. I
Mhm.
don't know. I'm not judging, I'm not deciding.
Uh-huh.
I'm just going along with it, you know?
Right. Yeah, that's very fascinating. And it's almost as though, again, not judging, but just analyzing and thinking it
Mhm.
through. The ghost, could even be a metaphor for something, right? And it is
Oh,
like, even if
yes.
it's just a story, it still is something that's existing throughout generations with people. And that powerful presence that's now with you, this
Yeah.
Leirarskotta, that whatever that is, it's a fascinating thing. You can have very different perspectives about what a ghost is, right?
Oh, yes, and there is a history of her having changed
Okay.
from being very angry. Oh, I have to tell you about how she got conjured up and everything. That's
Uh,
really exciting. But she began her career, her ghost life, because she was a
uh-huh.
human being before that. She
Mm,
began her life as a ghost, um, probably around the age of 20,
hmm,
and she was very angry. And
mm,
that's why the necromancers conjured her up to annoy
oh,
some people I'll tell you
mm,
about in a minute.
mhm,
And she was very angry and very bitter and very vicious almost for about 3 generations. And then she started to settle down and realize that these people were doing the best they could. She was observing their suffering. You see how this could be a metaphor, you know?
mhm,
She was observing their suffering, and, like, at the beginning it was out to get people, but later it became their enemies that she was out to get, and then she wasn't out to get anybody after about 5
okay,
generations. She is there to protect,
hmm,
and I was told by this pastor that she would protect me and watch over me, you
hmm,
know?
mhm.
Yeah. For
So it's
whatever
also
that's,
a
yeah.
story of forgiveness and becoming a nicer person, or in her case,
Yes,
a nicer
exactly.
ghost. Now, can she be traced to an actual person?
Ha 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 ha. I found one, but
Okay.
I'm stuck. I'm stuck.
Mm,
Well, first of all, I don't want to put her to an actual person unless I know for sure, and even then, there
mhm,
would be descendants. Well, she
right.
may or may not have descendants, but I did find a person.
Okay.
I went looking on Icelandic Roots
Mhm,
for a person, and I found a person that was born at the right time, so that when she would have had to have died. Oh, yeah,
mhm.
we'll talk about that because that's exciting. Oh,
Okay.
she died, and she had to have died under difficult circumstances,
Mm,
usually that she lost in love.
Mm.
Something happened and she didn't end up with the person she was supposed to be with, and she was upset and died of
Mm.
a broken heart. Oh, I
Mm.
love that story.
Mhm.
That's so sad. Yeah, she died of a broken heart, and so I had that happen in the story.
Mm.
And then these young fellows they were interested in a beautiful woman named Olaf,
Mm.
and Olaf was marrying the man who was the sheriff. He was a sheriff, so he was quite successful. And these other young men had wanted her to marry her, and she turned them down. These two men, I don't know if we know what their name was. I can't remember. Anyway, they decided when she died, this girl died, that they would conjure. First, they tried to conjure up a male ghost, and his name was Stormhat. You see, they even know this. Stormhat, Stormhutter. And somehow the husband was able to get rid of him. They did conjure him up, but then they came over to the house to start bothering them, and the husband was able to get rid of him. Then they went back and conjured up this young woman who had died, and she ended up being the ghost that is our ghost. So I wrote in the story about how a young woman, okay, oh, we're getting back to the real woman. The
Mm.
real woman that I found was born at the right time, so that she would have been around 20 at this exact time that this conjuring took place. And there
Okay.
is no record of her dying. And it's 17, she was born in 1686, I think it
Mm.
is. And so
Mhm.
she was around 20, and there's no record of her getting married, of having children, or dying. And she
Wow.
was adopted, so she wasn't living in the with her real parents.
Mm.
So it's
Okay.
very possible that this
Mhm.
could have been the person, and
Wow.
in the right area, in the right town, and everything.
Mm.
So I'm kind of feeling that it is. Of course, if
Mm.
you think that's her and you stop looking, you don't find anybody else. But
Yeah, that just
yeah,
it brings a whole new perspective to genealogy, and it's not just now the
doesn't
tracing
it? So they
of
conjure
family
her up.
members,
Here's how
but
they conjure her up. She's in the grave,
mm.
and she's just died and of a broken heart, and she's
Mhm.
lying in the coffin. And they go over to the cat to the cemetery, and they do all these uh, conjurings, and
Mm.
this of course was all illegal, but they did it anyway, apparently.
Mm.
And she comes up out of the grave to and goes to this one family.
Mm.
So I wrote about that too. I don't know anything about that either, but I looked up a lot of stuff and found information so that it could seem very real.
Wow.
Yeah. And I had in my story said that she was staying with a couple,
Mhm.
because a lot of farm people lived on
Mm.
farms that they didn't own,
Yeah.
and it looked like she wasn't adopted till she was 17. So
Hmm.
that's was almost like she would have been a servant in that house, that she
Okay.
was not being treated badly, but she was not being treated well, and that the owner of the house had a child that was the same age, and that child, of course, was deferred to always. And a young man came to the house in the dead of winter, and he and somehow got into her little cot, and something happened, and she got pregnant. She thought he
Mm.
was coming back for her. When he left, he came back, and he came back for the other girl, for the
Hmm.
owner's daughter. And so
Mhm.
that's how she got her heart broken in my story. Shouldn't tell my story, you won't want to read it.
Yeah, I didn't realize actually that maybe I remember you saying this, that you had gone to the Icelandic Writers Retreat.
Yes.
Yes,
Yes,
that's
it
very
was great.
fascinating. Mhm.
They get
Mhm.
they get writers from all over the world. It's not an
Mhm.
Icelandic event at
Right.
all.
Yes.
They always have one or two writers from Iceland,
Mhm.
and as I recall, it was a reasonable cost. It wasn't, and they
Mhm.
have scholarships for people who can't
Mm.
afford to go,
Mhm.
and they give workshops,
Mm.
and then we gather socially as well. And oh, it's wonderful, really
Yeah, yeah,
wonderful.
I certainly would like to go. I was looking at it this year, but it came up too quickly,
Yeah,
and
well, you're young
not
enough. You got about 50 more years you could go or more.
Yes, yes, certainly. Hopefully it
But you shouldn't
continues.
miss it. It's
Yeah, no.
very well. You
Mhm.
also get a network of people
Mhm.
that
Mhm.
you can speak to later about other things,
Mhm.
and yeah, and
Yeah.
it was started by Eliza Reid, who's the first
Mhm.
lady of Iceland. Oh, and when we went back with the group that day, we
Yes.
all went to see the president, and he couldn't
Mhm.
come because he had been taken away to some major event
Mhm.
that was in bad weather place or something.
Mhm.
And she was there, and as soon as she saw me, she said, "I know you. I remember you." And
Oh.
I was touched because I don't know that I did anything particularly
Mm. Mhm.
important there, but that was really lovely. And she's also a
Mhm.
Canadian, Eliza
Yes.
Reid.
Yes.
Yeah.
Wonderful person.
And a writer. She's a writer. Yeah, well, of
Mhm.
course, but she's a
Mhm.
good writer. Yeah.
Mm. Yeah, could you talk a bit more then about the writing process on your end, maybe with this writing of this ghost story or other books that you've written and well, I don't know, just maybe some inspiration that you have besides stories like this. What actually encourages you to sit down and write these stories out?
Um, I, they come to me. I
Mm.
don't. I will confess that I write fast. A lot of really
Mm.
good writers write slowly. I just happen to write very quickly,
Mm.
and right now I'm so proud. I'm just bursting, and you're giving me, and I haven't even told you, and I'm giving you an opportunity. You're giving me an opportunity to brag about this,
Mm.
but um, I've written books about for pastors that have been published
Okay.
by Pilgrim Press and Mercer Press,
Hmm.
and I have just recently completed what they call a Festschrift, which is a book in honor of a professor who passed away or one that they're honoring who's still alive, it's older. And my professor just died at the age of 94, Andre Lecoq. And in the last year, I have gathered 11 scholars, and they were all very good scholars, to
Mm.
write a chapter each. And
Mm.
I wrote a chapter, and that book just went in for publication. And they said,
Mm.
"We will let you know in 4 to 6 weeks if we approve of the way you did it and everything."
Mm.
And I'm sitting here thinking, I wonder what's going to happen. They'll probably send it back and say, "What are you thinking?" They had 68 pages of rules, 68-page book of rules of how this is
Wow,
supposed to be set out. And I
that's
passed
intimidating.
that
Oh.
spot, that part. So I just found out about 3 days ago that it's going to the copywriters next. So that's very, very exciting.
Mm-hmm.
Um, I don't think you make any money on these kind of things. I never worry about money because,
Mm.
if it comes, it comes. So that's
Mm.
the one thing I did. In the meantime, about 2 weeks ago, I haven't got the actual contract, but the promise for sure of a contract with Fortress Press
Hmm.
on a book entitled, are you ready for this?
Okay.
I'm so excited about this. I've already written it in my head, so it will come quickly. Um, it's entitled God in Translation.
Hmm.
And I'm talking about the Hebrew scripture and
Mhm.
all the really, really great stuff it says about God and how good and wonderful and loving God is.
Mm.
And the average Christian, I shouldn't say that, but many, many Christian people are very quick to say the Old Testament is full of the wrath of God, and we
Mm.
only, later with Jesus, we get love. And
Mm.
the love of God in the Old Testament is just tremendous.
Mm.
And so I'm doing 8 chapters translating with just a little section that people miss and
Mhm.
explaining what it is and giving
Mm.
us 8 more attributes in case we didn't think God was good enough. It's going to be really exciting.
Uh-huh.
And they had a process there with the publishers that
Mhm.
they go through. They have a committee, so you choose one publishing person, and then they go to the committee with your book proposal, and it goes
Mm.
round and round, and it came out very positive, and they're excited about it. So that's my next book. But i
Okay.
i do like the idea of writing novels,
Mhm.
um and I'd like to do that in the future, that tell
Mm.
some stuff. But this one, I'm kind of, I haven't published the
Mhm.
ghost book.
Mhm.
Um, I may have to self-publish it just because it's a genre that's very
Mm.
small, a
Sure.
niche market, I believe we
Mhm.
call that.
Yes.
I also wrote a book about I didn't write it, but I edited it and completed it about a famous tenor named John McCormick,
Hmm.
an Irish tenor. And that's when I was Irish. and, uh, and that book is over 800 pages. And it was suggested to me by someone, I think it was Boston College, that I put a hunk of that book, 3 sections of that book, directly onto the internet.
Hmm.
And so the book is smaller. It isn't quite as big. It would have been too big
Mm.
to publish. And I gave the instructions in the book of how to look it up on the internet. And the beautiful thing about that is there's sections about John McCormick's life, his repertoire, his life, his chronology, and his discography, so that the people that are studying him, which are many, can change it if there's any. Well, they can't change it, but the book
Uh-huh.
is alive. So if
Right.
they find out any information that I missed,
Hmm.
they haven't found any. They contact me and we change the book. And I
Mhm.
think that that's the future. That's
Yeah, no,
something new.
yeah, I would certainly agree, and that's very cool that you've been a part of that process. And you also mentioned like self-publishing too. That's something that, of course, isn't new, but the act of self-publishing is so much more easily accessible in
Mhm.
today's sort of internet age that it's almost a new concept in that really anyone can self-publish. And there has been a number of people involved in Icelandic Roots who have self-published books as
Mhm.
well. So
Mhm. I
yeah,
mean,
very
I
interesting.
didn't want to because I think you don't get money, but you get a lot of credit from having a real publisher,
Yeah.
and all that. But you
Mhm.
don't, if anybody even thinks a little bit about the financial situation,
Mhm.
if you can publish your own book, instead of getting 10%, you get like 80%. It's
Mhm.
huge difference.
Mhm. Mhm.
But you have to have a market.
Yes.
You have to know who your market is, and I knew in this case, so I had it self-published with a
Mhm.
company in
Mhm.
Canada that did a beautiful job.
Mhm.
Cost me about $1,500, and I got it all back in the
Mhm.
sales.
Yeah, I've been thinking
So
a lot about this with my own writing, and it does seem exactly like you said. There's some prestige that you get from publishing with a publishing house, and that's sort of a form of wealth in and of itself. It may not directly translate to more money, whereas on the other side, if you're self publishing, you can get much more of the proceeds of the book. But if it's not reaching the people,
Mhm.
which it might not because you don't have the marketing behind it, then it could be at a detriment. So there's
Yeah,
yeah, a couple
you got it
processes.
exactly right. Yeah. So you
Uh,
gotta do both, I guess.
I think so. Yeah, maybe you're doing the right thing
I think
then.
I'm gonna self-publish this one.
Hmm.
Because of our market.
Hmm.
I haven't been planning to do it because I was kind of going to wait for a publisher, but it's a little difficult because in Iceland there are a lot of publishers, but they're publishing their own stuff. And
Yeah.
I checked on getting it translated into Icelandic, and that would have cost me $6,000. So that was
Mm-hmm.
not an option. And I know I can see that it's a lot of work to translate a book,
Oh,
get it
yes.
right.
I could imagine. But that is something too I think will be helped with technology. I think it'll always need the human going over it in that language that it's being translated to.
Hmm. Hmm.
But I think it's getting much more to the case where technology will be able to get it to a certain degree of
That's right.
translation.
You're right.
I
Yeah.
suppose on Facebook now, you look at on the Icelandic Roots page, there's a lot of people that will give us comments in Icelandic, and it will translate it directly on Facebook. And I don't know if it's always totally correct, but it's
Close
quite
enough.
impressive.
Yeah.
Hmm. Hmm.
That's right.
Hmm.
Yeah.
So
That
there's a couple.
Icelandic Roots is a wonderful thing. I have to give it a couple of plugs in case
Oh
anybody
yes.
hasn't joined. If you have an Icelandic heritage at all,
Hmm.
join Icelandic Roots. I mean, everything, there's so much to do on Icelandic Roots. I can't
Hmm.
keep up with it. I
Oh no.
try,
Hmm.
but there are podcasts and group coffee hours and and all the information you ever wanted to know about your family, and mostly friends, new friends.
Yes. Yeah, and like you've been explaining, it's a great resource for people who are researching things, if you're writing a book, or even just, of course, understanding your family heritage better. But there's so many different avenues that it can be useful. And then testing different things too, I suppose. There's a community that you can share your ideas with and say, "Hey,
Oh,
I'm working
definitely,
on
and
this
they're
thing
and
or
they're
that."
with you. They're with
Mhm.
you, those people. Yeah,
Mhm.
yeah. Oh, I
So the
did use Icelandic Roots a lot for checking the families to
Mhm.
make sure I had it right, and but more than that, Icelandic Roots has a list of events that took place in history.
Mm.
So the volcanic eruptions are there,
Mhm.
and I have to check and make sure I got them in the right places
Mm.
because I don't want anybody suffering from a volcanic eruption that happened, 500 miles away. But
Uh-huh.
on the other hand, there were repercussions, like the weather changed. I
Oh,
mean, all
yes.
kinds of
Yep.
things. So
Mhm.
I check the date and see what was happening around that time,
Mhm.
because there were
Mhm.
some pretty drastic things going on, especially with the volcanic eruptions. Yeah.
Mhm. Yeah, no, certainly. Now, there's a couple other pathways from our conversation I would like to maybe go down, and perhaps we could just go to this because we're mentioning everything that's available on Icelandic Roots, and something that's been recent on your behalf is sharing an article for the Icelandic Roots blog, and you're discussing Bibles in for Icelandic immigrants when they were coming to North America, and the value and the benefits that they provided them beyond just having a Bible, but how that ties into maybe learning the language or different things such as that. So maybe you could share a bit about that piece of history that you recently wrote about.
I learned so much from that. I cannot begin to tell
Hmm.
you. I decided that I was going to give a lecture at the Society of Biblical Literature on the topic of the immigration to America related to bringing their religious books. I learned so much. It's incredible. And I always started with Icelandic roots and worked my way.
Hmm.
So, what happened was I decided, and I made the abstract about, I'm going to say this and I'm going to tell you about that. And
Hmm.
I didn't know anything, nothing.
Hmm.
And in the end, I shouldn't go all the way to the end, but just in case we don't have enough time, this is the most important thing, that
Hmm.
at the beginning I knew nothing, and at the end I knew that the person who translated the Bible directly from Hebrew and Greek. And I teach Hebrew and Greek, so it's seminary. So this is it did. So that's very exciting to me.
Hmm.
Into Icelandic, 30 years after Luther. That's very quickly
Hmm.
compared to other countries. It was like way
Okay.
up there in the top,
Hmm.
and was my 5 times, I think it was 5 times, X number of times, great grandfather.
Hmm.
Direct line. And
Wow.
then I started thinking, well, they talk about DNA. Of course, it's
Hmm.
slightly divided with all the other people involved, but still, I always wondered why, at the age of 40, when I was an opera singer, I suddenly wanted to be a biblical scholar
Hmm.
studying languages
Hmm.
and biblical texts. Because it wasn't because I shouldn't say this, but it wasn't because I was so religious or holy or spiritual or anything like that. And then I realized now it must have been somehow in my DNA that
Hmm.
had this same desire that he had, and I was thrilled. And then I found out that from the internet, because the internet tells us everything we need to know, that that uh, that if he had not translated that Bible into Icelandic
Hmm.
and distributed 500 copies when they had just invented the printing press, he distributed it to each of the churches in Iceland,
Hmm.
all of us Icelanders would be speaking Danish,
Hmm.
because the Danes were there and they were in control, and they weren't forcing the people to lose their language, but he said they would have lost their language.
Hmm.
So the fact that Icelandic exists today is related directly to this man. Um,
Wow.
yeah, and it's called the Guðbrandur Bible.
Mm-hmm.
And then his grandson later did a slightly different translation. And they say he had to because the King of Denmark said he didn't approve of everything. So he made some changes, and that was called the Thorlaker Bible. And you'd think my story was over, but it isn't. I went to Winnipeg last summer, which is my
Mm-hmm.
hometown, to the University of Manitoba Icelandic Collection Library, where they have 30,000 volumes. And
Mm-hmm.
there they were doing a display of Icelandic books because the Icelandic celebration was going on
Mm-hmm.
around that time, and they had guests from Iceland. And they brought out the Bible, the Thorlaker Bible, and
Wow.
I was standing there in front of it just in awe when Eigil, my fiance, pointed to it and said, "Look, what did you say your grandfather's name was?" And I told him, and my own grandfather had donated that Bible. That means it was his parents that brought the Bible on the ship from
Wow.
Iceland. So my genealogy was at the beginning of the story and it was
Mm-hmm.
at the end of the story. And at no point, I knew none of this. I was pretty excited,
Mm-hmm.
to put it mildly. And then with our group, you'll remember we went to Holar, and
Mm-hmm.
that was the place where this man Guðbrandur had been the priest or the bishop or something, and
Mm-hmm.
they had one of the Bibles there as well that had
Mm-hmm.
not made it to America. It was still in Iceland.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Mm-hmm.
we
Yeah,
visited
just
a lot of
another.
churches,
Oh
didn't we?
yes. Yeah, yeah. It was really, really incredible. And that story is another example of just how a person can really realize how connected you are to history, these different historical facts and realities of life. And then you place yourself in that too and realize, the different family connections. I think that's
I think
very.
anyone who's listening, if you haven't explored your genealogy,
Mm-hmm.
no matter who your parents are, we don't know
Mm-hmm.
who. I, when I was a little kid, my mother's family had never been anywhere or done anything as far as I was concerned, but they had a couple of those little elephants on my grandfather had on his dresser with the tusks that were made out of
Uh-huh.
little and some things that looked very African.
Hmm.
And I still don't know where that came from. Maybe they had a friend who visited Africa. I don't know.
Sure.
But
Mm-hmm.
you never know what's back there. And
Yeah,
it's
all the
good.
mysteries.
It's really
Mm-hmm.
good.
Mm-hmm.
I think
Mm-hmm.
it's good for everybody,
I
you
think so
know.
too. It really makes life worth living. Is it's not just about the future and the potential things that can happen to you in the future, but it's also like everything that you may be connected to in the past too. There's just all these mysteries around us, and it's so
Mhm.
fascinating.
It is so much mystery around us. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And
Mm-hmm.
and our very identity is connected with it. And
Yes.
sometimes, like I said, why we are the way we are, you
Mm-hmm.
know.
Mm-hmm. Yes, and yeah, and like you said as well, it's yeah, you have an interest in life, you have an inclination to do something, you don't really know why, and then you learn about your history and you realize there was someone in your past that had those interests too, and you start to think, "Oh, okay, maybe
I
there's
think
something
there's a
more."
lot in the imprint of our DNA somehow that
Mm-hmm.
we don't realize that is carried on.
Yes. No, I think you're right with that. This reminds me as well. When we were on the Icelandic Roots trip, I remember, and as you mentioned, we went to so many churches, we went to so many farms, we did so many things. But I do remember for you specifically when we were driving past and stopped by a farm that had been in your family history, and I don't remember the details, but I remember it had an emotional impact on you when we stopped by for that.
Yes, that was Deildartunga.
Mm,
And the reason is, and I have I keep thinking we're on TV here. I've got the two books right here. I can reach over
mhm,
and show them to you, Jack. They're two hardbound red books,
mm,
probably altogether maybe 500 or 600 pages with the family as it evolved from that farm.
mm,
So there's a picture of that farm in the front of the book. It was published around the 80s, 1980s, by some cousin who got into genealogy. And I can remember that my parents were not interested and didn't want to buy the book. And I kind of forced them to buy the book. And this book is all now that would be just my grandmother's family going back to 1704. And there are pictures in the book of people that everybody sent in pictures that they had, photographs, and so yeah, I'm a part of all those people too. I don't know any of them, and we're planning. We're planning. Actually, that's another story about the ghost. But we're planning to this ghost that we don't believe in. We think she wants to. She wanted to get redeemed, and I wrote that partly because I'm a pastor. She lived with three different pastors, so I have her saying, "Listen, I when I was a live person, I think this is really neat. When I was a live person at the age of 14, I was confirmed in the Lutheran Church, and that means that I should be able to get redeemed and go to heaven and not just disappear. And besides," she says, "I've been in this world for 8 rounds. You're only one, and you know how hard it's been. Life isn't easy. And I've been in for 8 lifetimes. And I think that I should be redeemed. So, seeing you're a pastor, the least you could do for me is ask." So that's what I do in the book. And I don't get an answer, but I guess she gets to go to heaven. Anyway, for what it's worth, so I told this to my secretary, and my secretary, the psychic woman, who's just like the rest of us in every other way, she says to me, she said, yes, she says, that's right. She wants to go but to heaven, but she wants to go back to Iceland. She wants to leave from there.
Hmm.
So we were too busy with the bus group to be sending her anywhere, and I didn't want to make a fool of myself. So we're planning to go back next year
Okay.
and
Wonderful.
release her from
Mm.
this world. And I don't know what that's going to mean. Some
Hmm.
lady that I met on the trip in Iceland gave me a big speech about what I was supposed to do. You know, she said,
Hmm.
well, you have to get a little box and you have to get a necklace with her name on it and put it in the box, and you have to bury it in the ground and build a cairn and
Wow.
say a few words.
Okay.
I don't know. I don't know
Yeah.
what we're going to do, but we're going. And the other
Uh-huh.
thing we want to do when we are in Iceland the next time is knock on a few doors of
Hmm.
those
Hmm.
farms. And
Yes.
Eigel has done it in Denmark, and he was well received. They gave him a cup of coffee, and they were welcoming. So I think that I'd like to go to that farm. Yeah, I was more excited, I think, because I didn't think I was going to get to see it.
Mm, right.
And we were always in a hurry. And this time they let me off the bus, remember?
Hmm.
And I got
Hmm.
off the bus and I was jumping up and down or something.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. So that's the farm that was. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Fascinating. Yeah. So as we begin to wrap up, maybe if there was anything else to talk about as it pertains to the ghosts, but I also wanted to, you mentioned going to China, and I remember talking about this with you during the trip, and I thought it was very fascinating because just before we went on the trip, I was living in Hofsos at Brimnes, which was Bill Holmes' house.
Mm.
And so I was
Hmm.
reading all of his books, and one of my favorites of his was his book on China, which, if I remember correctly, was called "Coming Home Crazy," uh, and something like the ABCs or the alphabet of China essays. And it was really fascinating, different things that he wrote about. But he lived in China for a year to teach there. And I think his
Right.
perspective was it was like going to somewhere that it could be the most different place that he could possibly go to. And I do
Yes.
think that's true in contrast to Iceland or North America, even, but maybe Iceland in particular. China's about the most opposite you could get. But fundamentally, we are all still humans, so I'm sure there's different variations on similar themes. But I do think it's fascinating too. If you look up what has the longest genealogical tracing of history is the Confucius line, which
Yes.
goes back
Hmm.
like 80 generations or something like that. So, a very different culture, but still is a very similar interest in genealogy and other such things. So, I don't know if there's any interesting stories or anything you could share about.
Oh, yes. You won't even have to interrupt. I
Okay.
it was so when you first get there, you think that wow, they're just like us. We're the same.
Hmm.
They think the same way I do. And by
Mm.
the time, the longer you stay, the more you realize how really differently they're thinking about various things. It's all good,
Mm.
it's not bad stuff,
Yeah,
but
sure.
it's different. And
Hmm.
so I would love to do that. We could talk about that sometime. I'd like to read his book first, though. How big is
Yes,
the
yes,
book?
I would really suggest it. Oh, it reads very quickly because it's like essays. It goes like alphabetically,
Oh,
A, B,
okay.
C, D, all the way
Oh,
through the
okay.
alphabet. You could just
Yeah,
read
I'm,
like
I'm very
an essay.
curious. When did he go? Do you remember?
Oh, I'm not sure. I think it was before the 2000s, maybe.
Yeah,
So
so it
maybe in
might
the
be.
90s or something like that.
Yeah,
Hmm.
was very good when I was there, and I don't
Hmm.
think I'd like to go back now for a number of
No,
reasons.
no, unfortunately
I'd be a
not.
little nervous about that.
Yeah, same here.
Yeah, that would be really good to talk
Hmm.
about that.
Hmm.
I do have great stories about China.
Yes. Okay. Well, I think there's definitely lots of different topics for a part two of a discussion.
Mhm.
But Doreen, is there anything else you would like to mention in this podcast?
No, I'm just delighted that we've had the opportunity to do it.
Hmm.
I've always wanted to do one, and I was invited to do one, and then the fella got sick, and we couldn't do it.
Okay.
And it was some church related thing. So
Mhm.
this was like you picked the thing. You could tell that I like to talk about, and was did never have the opportunity. So I'm very thrilled
Mhm.
about that.
Mhm.
Yeah,
Yeah.
thank
Well,
you, and thank you for having me. You are so, they tell me I'm multi talented, but you are multi talented. Yeah.
yeah. Well, thank you very much. And yes, this has been wonderful. And I would suggest anyone listening to also read your article. Have you written other articles for the blog too on Icelandic
Yeah.
Roots? Yeah.
I'm writing one about Haldor Laxness, the
Oh. Oh. Okay.
writer.
Yeah.
Writing it this morning. I was working on it, and I'm trying to think. I think I
That's
wrote one
interesting.
about Icelandic Dagurinn, the Icelandic celebration in Gimli, and kind of about feelings as
Mm.
a child and a
Mhm.
young woman about attending that event and what
Mm.
it meant to me. That
Yeah.
was one that I wrote, and I wrote one about Eriksson, Leif
Mm.
Erikson,
Uh-huh.
and I wrote one about my. Thank you. I wrote one about my amma, about my grandmother, and
Oh.
the necklace, silver cross that she gave me when I was 9, and
Mhm.
sent it
Mhm.
with a picture of it. Yeah. Hmm.
Yeah, cool. Well, anyways, lots to read on that. So I'd suggest anyone listening, if they would like to learn more, to read some of those blog posts. And it's too bad you've just mentioned Haldor Laxness, because that is definitely another topic too to talk about. So maybe for a future conversation as well.
Right. Right.
Hmm. Okay. Well, thank you very much. And we can wrap this up here now.
Well, thank you.
Hmm. Okay. So I'm going to click stop and it will maybe reset, but just stay in the call here.